Welcome to the Capital Discussions Roundtable. I'm Tom Nunamaker with our guests Dan Harvey and Gary Whitlock. Before we get started, a quick disclosure: the Capital Discussions is not a broker-dealer or an investment advisor. This presentation is for educational purposes only. We don't know your situation and have no way of knowing what level of risk is appropriate for you. We're not making any specific trade recommendations. The risk of loss in trading options can be substantial, so please be aware of all of your risks prior to placing any trades. Hypothetical computer-simulated trades are believed to be accurately represented. However, actual profit or loss may vary due to market factors such as liquidity, slippage, and commissions. And again, this is for educational purposes only. So with that, I'll stop sharing and give the ball over to Gary. And Gary, this is your first time on the roundtable, so we're happy to have you here. And like Dan said before we started the recording, maybe just tell folks a little bit about yourself, your background, and then we can get into the nifty tool that you've been working on.
Okay, my name's Gary Whitlock. I'm a retired engineer, retired a few years ago. Primarily was in hardware logic design, but did some analog, some firmware, and very little software. I worked for Burroughs, Unisys, QLogic, NRI, Mimic, and Octera, the companies I was affiliated with. All my background was in engineering roles. I had about 5 years in engineering management, the others purely technical. I currently manage funds for my family. I consider myself a novice trader. I'm still learning. Anyway, I continue to learn about options, which I hope will never cease. Also, on my own, I've been developing a tool intended for personal use for evaluating, tracking, monitoring, and backtesting. Content from this tool was used to support this SPX RTT entry evaluation. So that's kind of it about me.
Okay. You need to share your screen too.
You have the math.
Pardon?
Yes.
It's clear that you have the math background, which obviously, helped you in developing the tool.
Some. I definitely wouldn't consider myself very well versed in math. I look at things until they make sense, which for me it takes a long time, longer than I'd like to admit. But one other thing, I do actually get to rub shoulders with other people that are very sharp with some math stuff, so I can pepper them with some questions that'll help fill the gaps.
Well, you're a man after my own heart, because I think too many people, I know that I was involved. I'll just make this quick because I want to save all the time for you, but just in 10 seconds, I was involved in the development of some software, and won't mention the name, and one of the other developers, simply believed the numbers that came out of the first iterations of the software, and they didn't make any sense. But the guy said, well, I put the data in, and this is what came out, so it must be right. But of course, it was not right at all. So it's always important to have a seat at the pants evaluation of anything new.
Totally agree. I remember, what was it? Ronald Reagan said, "Trust but verify."
Right.
I actually think that's backwards. Verify, then you trust.
Okay.
Right? Because this is your money. You need you need to own it, right?
That's exactly true, Gary. You got it.
So, okay, I'm going to share my screen. Here we go. Hopefully this is...
There it is.
It's coming. You got it.
Okay. Yep. So what this is kind of an add-on for the SPX RTT service. It's a productivity assist. This for a 50,000 foot view of this. Determining the best, I'm just going to read through the things.
And Gary, before you get started,
yes.
A lot of people may not know what the RTT is, so that's the road trip trades.
Yes, sorry. Yep. And I focused, I'm getting a little off, I focus only on the SPX, not the ES, because one of the things I've been trying to do is not have too wide a view of things because I can't keep up with everything. So I basically just focus on SPX, and I can work through things much better than I used to. I started this off trying to do SPX and RUT, and I trimmed RUT back so I could just concentrate on SPX, and that's actually been a good thing to just try to narrow the focus to work out the details.
Good idea.
Yep.
Determining the best broken wing butterfly configuration for a new SPX road trip trade entry typically requires a lot of effort and time and can be subjective and fat finger prone process. So this is a systematic process is available now that can be used as a second opinion for evaluating the candidates. Dan and Tom graciously documented a framework for choosing good broken wing butterfly configurations for new entries via the RTT entry tool on the website, on the Road Trip Service website. Because they did that, I was able to just code it so I can actually use that same information and just grade all the viable candidates for the new entries. But I can automate it, so I just look at all of them. This set of slides provides some information on this tool extension, and this is probably not the right phrase to use, but it can be considered a couch potato connoisseur's goal of using the entry tool. But it's actually, to me, I think it's actually more than that. If you want to have a cockpit that has the equipment and indicators that you trust, so it's kind of a little bit like that for me. This tool was developed to minimize the manual effort, and I'm sure some of y'all have had some issue with that. Maybe not. Speed the evaluation process and evaluate all possible variations. It's just a possible time saver. And allow more precise evaluation by capturing a near atomic snapshot of option price data for the evaluation. I don't really know how valuable that is, but being an engineer, it sounds like it would be nice. Why not? So what I mean there is, if you're going through this process of looking at all these things, the market is moving as you're going through it. So if you look at one piece at one time and another piece at another time, you may not be getting a good view. This basically takes a snapshot, then evaluates.
That is tremendously valuable to have the on-the-spot, evaluation. So, that is the beauty of this, because as you pointed out earlier, and for those people who have been using the Road Trip Trade Entry tool, there is an element of time involved in running through these things, and it might take up to 10 minutes to run through 3 or 4 or 5 possibilities and evaluate them. That's the beauty of your tool, Gary.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you. Okay, the next. This is I've gone over this about me. Here's some nitty-gritty details about the high-level strike choices. This is how I go about making sure I cover all possible candidates. The upper leg, I begin with the at the money and just pick each available strike down $45 below that. This is expected to be a superset of all candidates. For the short strike, basically ensure grab a superset of rational choices. I have 2 parameters I use to guide this. I go from 2.5% down to 5.5% down from each upper long strike. So then for the lower long, kind of grab all practical choices and then some. The idea is I will filter out those that are maybe excessive. These selections are then constrained to some broken wing butterfly ratios that are intentionally loose and forgiving. I didn't want to throw anything out too early. I specify that by a couple of constraints. This is kind of sorry for the cryptic nature of these, but this is actually the code. The lower width divided by the upper width has a minimum of 1.25. The lower width divided by the upper width has a maximum of 2.0. That's the current constraints I'm using. I used to have that as 1.0 and 4.0 until here a while back, and I had a kind of out of bounds match that had a 1.2 lower div upper ratio with a lot size of 38. So it's kind of, we probably don't need that because it's commission intensive. So I tighten it back up. We may still need to tighten this up more. That 1.25 is probably a little bit too low, but currently when we have them down there, some other criteria fails and they get weeded out. But and the filter produced by applying Tom and Dan's RTT entry guidelines generally rule out any unworthy configurations. For each broken wing butterfly configuration evaluated, the same configuration with an initial reverse Harvey is also evaluated. So cover those as well. Currently, the initial reverse Harvey is set to be a 10-point wide strike. We can modify that whenever we need. I've done that, I think, once when we only had 25 strikes to see if that would show up anything. But the 10-point seems to be a pretty decent number for now.
And just
Gary,
for those who...
Yeah, go ahead, Tom.
I was just going to say people may not, if they're not familiar with the term reverse Harvey, all that is taking one of the upper longs and rolling it down 10 points.
Right, and I was also going to add that the only reason that this maneuver would be done at the time of trade launch is in situations in which volatility levels are really low and the butterflies are correspondingly more expensive. We will do a reverse Harvey right at trade launch to make the net cost cheaper without impacting the risk too significantly. So that's the rationale for that. And so Gary's tool allows this. Unfortunately, in the last, couple weeks or so, we haven't needed to do this. So, yeah, go ahead, Gary. You're doing great.
Next one. There are some pre-filters. One is specify the maximum risk we're willing to take. And currently this is $20,000 for a trade entry. And I try to kind of follow Dan's lead on what the size of this is, so this will match. And we've been $20,000 for a while. This is the maximum risk, similar to the Reg T margin. The minimum lot size is set to 5, which serves to ensure the configuration can support adjustments. If it was fewer, then the reverse Harveys might not work as easily. DTE is controlled by a min-max range where the lowest matching DTE will be used. This says current setting is 72 to 85. We're changing that now to kind of 70 to 85. And when there's two expirations that may hit this range, there'll be 2 reports. So I'll catch the earlier and the later. So that can help if you're wanting to add something to an existing position. There was a criteria, I believe, is choose a short strike near 28 delta. That came from the standard road trip entry tool. And so I do that by setting my delta target to be between 15 and 35 to hit that. Next, the IV and the Greeks. All the IV is derived from the bid-ask spreads with supporting information from the St. Louis Fed and Quandl for interest rates. The underlying price is adjusted for dividends using this kind of cryptic form, U equals NDX minus PDIV. NDX is basically the index spot price. PDIV is the present value of the dividend. This is actually derived from the complete option chain using a process documented by Steve Spear, another CD member, in one of his white papers. This step is very important for precision. With this was a big deal for me, finding out about this. It's really cleaned up a lot of stuff. This is not worded very good, but this is not perfect. But I believe, for my purposes, the way I'm handling the stuff, I prefer it over TOS for how I'm handling the IVs and stuff. And when I've looked at the option view EIOIO model, it seems to track very close. I don't know how option view is doing it, but I seem to be doing similar things. So I don't have any reason to suspect there's an issue. The IV surface plots, well, this is kind of, the IV surface plots do not raise eyebrows or concerns. What I kind of mean there, if you look at the TOS IVs, when you, you'll see these weird anomalies in the IV charts that are really not there. This is just the way they handle the IV. So I don't have that when I go through this process. They're smooth. The puts and calls, IVs are identical as they should be. So, given the IV from above, the Greeks are simply derived from the Black and Scholes model. Next. Also have currently in here is an entry for selecting the minimum open interest if I wanted to grade them based on that. I kind of plan on de-implementing this. We haven't needed it yet. And I also have live vol data for historic, which does not support open interest. So if once I delete that, I have a seamless interface between RTD from TOS and live vol. There's no difference. I can switch back and forth without any issue. So I'll probably drop that just to keep it nice and clean. Excuse me. There's also an entry for minimum number of $25 strikes. Currently, its default is set to 0. I may bump that up sometime whenever we have 7 of 7 candidates and need a better filter for pulling that down to, scrape the cream, scrape off the top cream. So I still think that could come in handy someday.
Well, Gary, I think it's to just interject something here. I think it's really good that you're able to modify the parameters here, because the market environment will change as we go along, and the three of us will work together to, maybe do a few tweaks on this if needed. So far, not much has been needed. You and I have been working together, I know, on the parameters, but so far I've been very pleased with it. So, and I agree with the open interest. I think at the present time that can be safely dropped.
Yep. Most of the numbers in this and parameters and everything, all basically I've currently got just set up as defaults, and all the defaults can be overridden. So it's fairly flexible. A relationship to the web-based road trip trade entry planning tool. There are 7 pass-fail tests that correspond to pass-fail referenced in the web planning tool. Those are numbered. I think there's 5 steps. One of those steps has 2 criteria, and there's 1 pass-fail prior to the first step. So each of those 7 steps are separated here. The criteria I'm using this tool should precisely track the web tool, except for some rare circumstances. Current known difference is the short strike distance from the market. The web-based tool currently lists 3.5%, and my tool uses 3.2%. I believe that was a change that we wanted to go to 3.2 some time back. There is one other difference, is the web-based tool lists the some convergence. I forgot what the term was.
Yeah, that was the convergence. it was originally called the inflection point, which was actually my fault because, I mean, I know what an inflection point is, and I don't know why I used that term because it was not an inflection point, but it was but it was a confluence of
that's right.
the day step curves, and but that has been now replaced. I don't think we've done this on the actual website entry tool, but that has been supplanted by 6% down.
Right. Currently, what I'm doing with this tool, I'm showing both. I still show both, but I'm grading it based on the new criteria. But I have not observed any differences in those two since I've been doing this. They will diverge at some point, maybe, but they basically seem to be fairly interchangeable.
Yeah, they're very close. I actually went with the 6% because it's a constant number and it's easier to calculate. But I chose it because that's the point at which, somewhere in that general area, the day step curves are going to become confluent.
The next one. Oh, there's an initial position probability-based examination that's been added to the tool. Here a while back, Dan discussed Nathan's web-based tool, the Option Risk Calculator, which performs Monte Carlo simulation, and he showed using the initial road trip trade position and then extracting data from that analysis. After he did that, I said, well, that looks like a neat thing to throw in as well. So I went off and implemented that, and it did the Monte Carlo eval and everything. I was noticing when I did the Monte Carlo, some samples, I would get more samples. I mean, some points would have higher density of samples than others. So it looked like the distribution wasn't clean. And I got to thinking about it, and there's actually, I don't believe there's any need for doing Monte Carlo. You don't really need random numbers because you already have all the data you need. So I basically did a replacement algorithm that produces the same target metrics provided for each candidate we evaluate. And rather than use random numbers in Monte Carlo, I merely solve for the data directly to remove the noise and variability that seems unwarranted to me. If you have a bad random number generator, you're going to get a lot of garbage. Plus, it'll change each time you run it, so I didn't see a need for that. So I believe, given the identical source data, my results should match that of the Monte Carlo if an infinite number of sims on the Monte Carlo are performed.
So, Gary, I just would point out here for the benefit of newer members, this is a very unique and extremely, in my opinion, valuable addition to the road trip trade entry tool and to your software. And the reason is this: we don't want to take a trade which is likely to fail simply based on probability performance alone. In other words, we don't want to take a trade that is probably going to fail if you never do anything, which would mean you're going to have to adjust your way out of it to make it successful. And you might have to do a lot of adjustments, and it still might not be successful. So the addition of this, this algorithm, I think that's of tremendous benefit. And I've asked Gary, and he has done so, to actually incorporate that or the results of this, into the grading process. So as the candidates are filtering and percolating towards the top, they're all going to, as I understand it, Gary, they're all going to pass this addition. Otherwise, they're not going to percolate up. Is that correct?
Well, we can reduce the grade criteria, drop the barrier low enough such that these would appear, but typically they won't. This has a slightly higher weighting than the other the other 7 tests. We can increase that distance. We can give this even a higher rating to make sure they never show up. Because I agree with Dan. If we have one that ever fails this, probably shouldn't take it. So maybe I shouldn't present it too.
So this is, yeah, I mean, this is something that I have never seen anybody, I've never seen any kind of service be able to provide this, you know, other than Nathan's service, but that's all manual entry. So imagine the time that it would take to manually, enter prices into Nathan's tool, not to take anything away from it. It's an excellent tool, but it is labor intensive to enter that data in. And with Gary's software, this is done for you automatically.
Correct. For source information for the evaluation, the information I'm using here, the Nathan's tool also needs the same information. So I'm just basically showing here's the data. You can run it through my tool. You can run it through Nathan's tool. The volatility, for the volatility input, I look at the option chain and I use the CBOE VIX white paper to determine the volatility at that target. That'll pretty much match what TOS says it is. So I compute this on the fly, so you don't have to worry with that. The next thing, this is also evaluated at 15 days back from expiration. So it's T plus DTE minus 15. Look at the P&L risk graph of the new position, plus or minus 3 standard deviations of the underlying price for the specified future time, that DTE minus 15. Nathan's tool does the same thing. I use a cumulative normal distribution function for mapping the price distribution. I just picked the same one that's used by my Black-Scholes model. So it seems to work fine. Need the center point for the underlying price for the normal distribution. I use the forward price of SPX at that DTE minus 15. I use the form that use that U price, which is kind of like the present value, and times EXP RT for the convert it to the future value. That seems to be pretty good. And then for the interest rate, I get it from the Federal Reserve and Quandl. This I pull down every morning. It's an automated process. Just download that each morning before the market, so I don't have to worry with it. Next. This is maybe going into too much detail, but this is exactly the algorithm for replacing that Monte Carlo sum. I create 1,000 equally spaced bands from minus 3 standard deviations to plus 3 standard deviations of the price. My thinking is 1,000 should provide adequate precision. So these are equally spaced. I determine the center point for each of these bands. For that center point, I compute the P&L for each. So there's 1,000 prices of P&L computations across this 1,000 step range. Excuse me. For each band, I use that C&D function to determine the probability of occurrence for each band. The sum of this whole thing should be 1, right? That's all of them. I sum these 2 things here may not be clear, and well, I sum the product of each bin P&L times the bin probability. The result of this is the mean P&L. This is actually your expectancy, your expected value. I sort the P&L of all bands in ascending order, but maintain knowledge of the original position, so I can dial back out the probabilities. Then for this is sorted in P&L order, so the worst P&L to the best. And then for this sorted P&L, I do a running sum of the product of the original probability times 100 of the bin, which is actually the percentile. So this problem doesn't make any sense unless you're familiar with Nathan's tool, and I've gone through it a few times. If you have, hopefully these will make sense.
Well, Gary, yeah, this is, for newer people, this is basically calculating the probability weighted payoff curve, and
Yes.
it's the same as in any Monte Carlo simulation tool like this. And interestingly, it's the same process in which expected return is calculated, and it's the same type of thing that a casino would do. What's the probability and what's the payoff at that probability, and in our case you add those all up and you get the expected return. And Gary has neatly divided this into 1,000 bins, and I would agree that's clearly adequate in my view. And it's a very nice process, Gary.
Yeah. Well, doing it, dividing it into 1,000 bins basically says, okay, now I no longer need Monte Carlo. I've got all the data, all the precision I need, so I don't need it. So this was kind of critical in being able to not have to do Monte Carlo. Using the percentile above, then I just dial out all the points of interest, right? We've got certain metrics we want. I just pull most of those from this step. I'll flag the inflection point at the sharp slope change point, which is maybe I've got that up here. Let me see. If we have time, I'll try to kind of rush through some of this stuff so you can see how this tool correlates to Nathan's. See, window dressing, minimum grade set to either. When I run the tool, I set a grade target of 6 or 7 to run, and basically it'll continue to run until I get something, right? So if I set it to 6 and I only get 5, it'll just repeat and just keep doing more samples until it gets something that hits the criteria. So I may have to tweak this if I'm wanting to force it to come out at a certain time every day. I may have to reduce this threshold. This 6 of 7 or 7 of 7, depending on quality of available candidates. This is actually changing to a total of 7. There's 6 from the standard road trip trade tool, and the static based assessment is the 8th grade. So it's actually kind of 8 in total. Currently, the static position assessment takes a few orders of magnitude more processing than the others. So I actually do the initial road trip trade first, and if they get past the threshold there, then I will apply the static position assessment to those. So that's why I've kind of got it broke at 6 of 7, and other places you may see the 6 of 8 or 7 of 8. So only candidates meeting whatever I've set here will be processed. Reporting results will show a leading plus for passing criteria and an offset leading minus for failing tests. This is so you can quickly observe pass or fail, because otherwise it's kind of, I'll throw just like here's one that fails. So I've got it offset, that minus, so hopefully it jumps out at you. This is not good, right? Where these are all pass, there's a fail. Sorry.
So that's actually worth looking at when you review the report. That's actually worth looking at the individual criteria. For example, if the T plus 10 criteria fails, you probably don't want that one because that's going to be risky. Conversely, if the criterion for 1.5% above at 15 DTE fails by a little bit, and you can see the percentages in there in the report, that might still be a viable candidate because we know we'll make up for some of that maybe by adding a baby butter or put credit spread or reverse Harvey. So it is worth the time to look and see if there are any minus signs there indicating a fail for that particular for that particular parameter. Which one was it? And then use that to make your decision.
When we do the grading, we then sort the candidates by this sequence. As we find better sequences, we will update this. But the first is by highest grade. The grade is how many passes. And we can have 8 items we're measuring. The last one being that static position assessment.
Gary, can I interrupt just a second?
Yes.
We had a question here. Actually, it was a request for you to perhaps show the report format, and then we'll go back to the things you're discussing now, so that people who have never seen this report will have an idea what it's going to look at. Would that be possible?
Of course.
Okay.
Let me see if I can figure out how to do this.
Slideshow from
current
slide. There we go.
So this is kind of the report layout. I've got top 2 lines is what and when, right? What it is we're talking about and when did it happen. So this is basically, so I'm doing broken wing butterflies, and this is the expiration. In parentheses here, I have the DTE. The last price of SPX was this, and this was taken at this date, at this time, and this is Pacific time. So that's when this was taken. So everything is locked in at that time step. The static position analysis is going to be using this annual volatility. This 14.57 happens to be the volatility of this expiration. Annual interest, Quandle or Fred says I should be using 1.31 if I'm handling that right.
So I think that's very interesting, Gary, that the annual volatility uses the volatility of that expiration, as opposed to the vol index. I think I was not aware until just now that you were able to pull that in, but I think that's excellent.
Yeah, and again, this is I basically pull in that entire chain and use that CBOE white paper and just go through that algorithm to dial it out. Except the CBOE white paper is looking at 2 expirations. This is just 1, right?
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So it's averaging 2. Here, there's no averaging. It's just look at the 1. And this other section here is kind of the goals and requirements specification. These are come from some parameters that typically are not changing. These should be fairly static. And so you can see what everything was. I was looking for this DT range from 70 to 85. I found an 80, right? So there was nothing between 70 and 80, or it would have hit. Then let me see. There's a next section of this. After this, the next thing down in this report is where I'm running the eval, and there's kind of a couple of passes. First is go through the standard road trip trades, and in this case there was 1,800 configurations that were examined. Of those, all but 95 were ruled out because they failed some filtering things. So down here, these discarded are the ones that didn't make it to be graded. So 1,419 of them were broken wing butterfly wing ratio failures. So these failed that 1.25 to 2.0 criteria. 286 of them were minimum lot size failures. So, and this just shows the highest grade was 7. This shows what the grades were for the ones we observed. If you'll notice here, I think I was targeting for this a grade of 6 or better, so there's 9, 10, 11 of them here that meet the criteria to be looked at. When this next section here is where I do them with the initial reverse Harvey. And here you can notice the number of permutations are different. 1440. This is because not all the strikes had a strike $10 down. So that's the difference here. And when I went through this, there were none that met the 6 of 7 criteria. So if I go one step further, hopefully I'm using the same thing. There should be 11 total that are evaluated. So yeah, here, reporting 6 top-ranked candidates of the 11 that were graded. So I'm not sure if this is the best place to go through. Let me see here. Oh, here I can correlate it with the standard road trip entry tool. Basically, I'm trying to just show side by side. Here's the new report. Here's the entry tool, and for each of these, this information is conveyed here. It's basically a one of one. Start strike. Show where each of these criteria are related. This one is one that was modified, the confluence point. So I list the confluence point. I also list the new criteria. Looking at the price, 6% down. And when I do the grading, here's the 7 tests: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and here's shows where they are in the planning tool. Is this kind of am I veering off?
I think that's giving a good visual of what correlates to what and how the tool works.
Yeah, I think that's good, Gary. And people might in fact want to, since I'm assuming your PowerPoint will be attached to this, Tom and Gary. Yes,
I can.
People may want to print out this particular slide because. Gary and I have been working, obviously, Gary's a programmer here. I'm not taking any credit for this other than working with Gary to develop this to make, to ensure that it matches the entry tool criteria. And I must say thank you, Gary. He's been very willing to work with me on this. And sometimes he has to explain software things that he can and cannot do to me. But I think you'll agree, Gary, we have taken great pains to make sure that your tool matches up with the road trip trade planning tool and then with the Monte Carlo simulation.
Agreed. Yeah, I would feel awful bad if I had something misleading, and found out about it. I'd have to fix it. I can't do that. I also kind of expanded this for comparing it to the Monte Carlo tool. This probably shouldn't be here, but when I went through this, I didn't spend the time to get my tool to exactly match the Monte Carlo. This one, the Nathan's tool, has an entry here for dividend rate that typically you probably wouldn't be using. I believe, my belief is if you provided that with a proper value, you would probably get the results to be very close. Right now, I'm not using that, so we have a difference here. The mean price on this date is just following from the current stock price. And I believe if we provided the proper dividend rate, he would probably dial that back in. What I'm using for that is using the forward price. So these would probably match if you plugged in the right value here. Another difference would be the P&L curve. This curve here is a P&L for 15 days from expiration. This one is different from mine, I think primarily because we didn't give him the dividend information. So it's no fault. I believe his tool does a dang good job for the minimum information we give it. But if we give it the complete picture, I think it would do a much better job.
Yeah, I think it is the dividend variable that makes the difference here, because I've looked at that too, Gary.
So right now, this one is showing a little bit higher than mine does. Actually, here.
I think these differences are negligible, though, because I have done some comparisons between your software results and then actually plugging values into Nathan's, and there are differences, but in terms of the decision-making point, I have not found any critical differences. I think, I'm very comfortable with your software.
That's good to hear. I've probably not done that much testing. I did a few things to figure how I think the thing is working and kind of went from there. But this is just, I'm basically, this is my P&L curve from one of my runs. Each run, I do the static assessment, and this is just pulling out the price versus the P&L. These graphs pretty much match, except for the error with the dividend. This is the probability, which is his. He doesn't have a y-axis here, but if you'd integrate from this probability curve all the way across, it should be a value of 1, right? All cases.
Yeah.
So that's all it is, and basically I'm just showing it. I just use that. It's the same thing. Probability curve there. Here is after when you run the simulation to do the Monte Carlo, it'll produce this report, the probability chart. And what I'm showing here is what his chart showed, and down here is when I ran it, and basically trying to produce the same things. My numbers are not exactly the same as his, I think, because of this, primarily the dividend. But they're fairly close. Here's the same chart from my run. So you notice they look kind of similar.
Well, I think these differences are negligible, Gary, and I've been very impressed with this. And we do pick. Gary and I work together on this. We do pick 3 points, which you see there, which we use as part of the evaluation process. And Gary, you can go ahead and explain those points, or I can, whichever. But they do match up and close enough to be able to interpret and make a decision based on those interpretations.
Well, why don't you're much better at this than I am. Dan.
Well, I'm not, Gary, but I'll be glad to do it. So
you're a better driver.
If you look at the leftmost the arrow there, perhaps Gary, you could circle that, or do you have the cursor to circle that, or
this guy?
Yeah, that guy. That is what Gary calls and we call the lower inflection point. And we want that to be, I think your current value is now 17 point or 18, I guess it is.
Right, yeah, 18 is our current.
We don't want anything higher than that because remember, this is a percentile graph. So that means that if it is, let's say it was a 22, that means that you have a 22% chance of this trade failing based on probability alone, as opposed to the ones we like, which are 14, 15, 16, that you'd have that percentage likelihood of failure based on probability alone. So that's one point we chose. Then we chose the 50% point because we want that, which is the next arrow to the right. We want that to be positive because otherwise you're basically taking a trade that is not likely to make any money based on probability alone. And then the final point, the final arrow there on the right, I chose that arbitrarily as a 60 percentile point, meaning that 40% of the time, based on probability alone, you're going to make that amount of money and maybe more. So I chose that 60 percentile point because, for example, if you had two candidates which were comparable in every other way, but the 60 percentile point of one was a lot higher than the other, well, you'd want to take that one because that means that 40% of the time you're more likely to make more money on that candidate than the other. Does that about do it, Gary?
I think so. Let's see. I made one comment earlier. This may be. I may be getting off target, but I made one comment earlier that when I'm running the stuff after using Steve Spear's recommendations for how to handle some of the pricing, my IV curves did not raise eyebrows of concern. So I just show, here is an example of my put IV on this state, where if you notice the curves are all very smooth. There's no weird inflection points or anything. So this is all the IVs that were available on, or all the strikes that were available on SPX on that date at that time.
That is a beautiful graph. I'm amazed you were able to generate that graph. That's, I mean, for a non-engineer like myself, I mean, I went through calculus and that's all I know. And that was literally 50 years ago. I still retain a bit, but that to me is gorgeous.
Yeah, I thought it was. I fought a long time before I could get this. You've noticed the moneyness axis is one of the reasons why this looks regular. If you just look at just strike, then that's what you get. That's the same information, just looking at the strikes. You know, this axis is strike instead of moneyness.
Yeah.
So you get the shorter term that appears to be sharper angles than the longer term. But it's kind of interesting. It's actually the same data, just how you graph it.
That is interesting.
And anyway, let me see. Did I have? Let me see if I can get this. Figure out how to.
And Larry, no, this tool is not for sale. Sorry.
Let's see, did I get through all this? Yes, actually, I did. Okay, I guess let me see if I can go through. If there's questions I wasn't looking at that.
Yeah, Gary, I've been monitoring the questions. Probably Tom has as well. There was one question about volatility changes at various price points, but you have to use you have to come up with some, annualized volatility. Do you see that question there?
Yes. Yes. No, it's a good question. It's actually a very important question. A lot of times with the volatility, there's a number of ways to try to address this, right? I mean, the typical toss individual implied volatility method and the option view EIOIO method basically use kind of, I think I'd call it sticky strike. Whatever the volatility is, you basically assume that's not changing. Now, we all know that's not true. It's not really true, but that is kind of the knee-jerk first response for doing this. There are fancy ways to try to guess or do a better guess. In some of the variable models, I think OptionView does. And there's some weird stuff I don't quite understand about TOS when they use the vol smile, which seems very odd. They're trying to come up with different ways of estimating what the volatility is going to be do in the future. I have not gained confidence in those. So currently I'm just using the sticky strike, similar to the way EIOIO does, and the TOS individual implied volatility. Daniel, does that Does that answer your question?
And there was another question about, is annual volatility the same as historical vol as calculated by TOS?
Okay.
That's up at the top of the report.
I think that's the annualized volatility that you're using based on the volatility of that cycle, aren't you?
Yes.
Yeah.
So actually, let me see. Do I have TOS over here? They should. Let me see. Basically,
they will be different, by the way.
So
and
it would be basically track these numbers right here on TOS. That should be fairly close.
But those numbers, I think it's important to point out, are different from what TOS calls the vol index of SPX.
Yes.
So I think, as I mentioned earlier, and I didn't know that you were able to bring this in, Gary, until just now. As I said, I think it's excellent that you're using the volatility for the cycle in question. And these will change, and that's the reason why being able to get these on the spot, every day, and it'll be different, today from yesterday, and it'll be different tomorrow. I think that is a critical factor in generating these reports. Wouldn't you agree, Gary?
Yeah, I think so. Well, it's as close as I can get to where I think it should be. Right? If we came up with something we thought would actually be better, I think we'd switch to it. But right now, this seems to be fairly close, and and the algorithm is documented, so I can debug it.
And before, we're coming up on an hour, but before too many people leave, I just want to point out that this is going to be available as a $15 a month add-on to Road Trip subscribers. So the tool is basically a report that Gary generates. We're working to have him inserted in a database, so people who get this add-on will get real-time notifications if a new one's been posted, and then it'll just be another tab on the class page where you can go look at the current reports. And it'll also be available, I think, to trial members. And probably, Gary, what do you think, another week or two before we have everything ironed out and we actually turn on the paid subscription for the add-on?
Well, that sounds good.
Okay, so if you're a Road Trip subscriber now, you can go to the forums. There's a dedicated forum for this that Gary's been posting all these reports. And the trial members will also have access to it, but that the user doesn't have any control of the parameters. That's Gary's code generating a report. But it's very useful. I used it the other day to find a tool or to find a trade. And literally, I put the trade on an option view, looked at it, it's like, well, this is a trade I would have found eventually, but it looks good, so I put the trade on. It was, saved me a lot of time. So I really appreciate the tool, Gary. It's really amazing.
Sure.
And I do exactly the same thing. I have gained so much confidence in working with Gary and in reviewing his report and and comparing that with what I would choose manually. I use Gary's software basically, and there was a question about the time and the current plan, I think, Gary, and of course we may modify this. So you tell me if I'm about to say something wrong. But the current plan is for Gary to generate this sometime following the first market hour. And so it might be 90 minutes after it's open, or it might be 2 hours after it's open. But we don't want to generate this thing right at the open because the prices will be funky. And secondly, this definitely will, as far as possible, unless something happens to Gary, and he has this automated, so this will be done once a day. And thirdly, currently, as Gary mentioned, we're looking at a window of 70 to 85 days. So there will be some times when there will be 2 cycles, and this is extremely useful. To have the older of the 2 cycle, and I use it to find an add-on. For example, And I don't know, we might even want to move this to 65 to 85 if that wouldn't be a major tweak. But the advantage is for the older cycle of the two, I'm often able to find a trade, and it might be a 40-60 instead of a 50-75 or 50-80 or 55-95. It might be a 40-60, but I'll see how that fits or incorporates into my existing structure, and if I like it, will add that on. And I've made quite a bit of extra money by doing that.
And a couple more questions. You don't need TOS to use this because Gary is basically pulling all the data that he needs to generate the report. And the online tool, that's going to stay there. That's not going away. So don't feel you're going to lose access to the entry planning tool if you don't pay that extra $15 for the add-on when that subscription starts. You'll still have access as a Roadtrip subscriber to that online JavaScript-based tool indefinitely for no additional charge. So, and John, modifying the DTE, again, it's a static report that Gary's generating, so that would be something that Gary would have to decide to modify the DTE window.
Yeah, I think Dan just mentioned 65 to 85, so I'll do that. Right now there are no 65, so it'll still just be one for this term, but I'll widen that window.
Well, yeah, thanks, Gary. And I should just say parenthetically, Tom and I obviously feel that this is an extremely valuable add-on. We think you get the bang for the buck. Obviously, as Tom said, the original Roadtrip trade entry tool will still be available, but we think you really get your bang for the buck with this software. I think Gary has done a tremendous job, and I'd like to congratulate him for doing such good work, and also for your good presentation, Gary. You did a great job on this. It's beautiful. And there's a question here: is Dan adding a second Roadtrip trade to the early cycle? Yeah, not an entire Roadtrip trade in terms of size, but for example, simply add a 1 or 2 lot butterfly using Gary's software criteria, which would find a good one. We'll say at 70 DTE for the same cycle that you have the original one on, but now there's only 70 days left as opposed to say 85. But it still pops out to be a really good butterfly. What I will do is look at my existing strikes, and I'll see if I can just sort of insert it into the core butterfly structure. And usually I can. I might have to modify one of the strikes by maybe 5 points so I don't step on something. But usually I can just incorporate it into the existing structure, and I find I am making more money with that.
And that's not a baby butter. That's the core butterfly, right?
Yeah. That
when
I would
you're
be adding it. Yes.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, maybe I said baby butter, I apologize. But no, I'm adding it to the core position.
And then Dorian had a comment, it would be good to have a trade entry tool for the baby butter as the criteria are different. That's maybe something for version 2, I think.
That's version 2, yeah, because that's a different set of parameters there.
Yep.
I want to point out one thing I don't think I mentioned. The second line of each of these criteria is a sample toss order. So this bisect space, you can copy and paste that into toss if that's what you would want.
Well, that's a time saver.
This one here, this price that it shows up is actually just this mid price rounded to the closest nickel. So there's no fancy business. Look at this, round it closest nickel, plug it in here, and that's it. This trailing thing, CBOE, if it's a monthly, I'll put the CBOE thing there. I had heard, I don't know if this is really true, but I'd heard that if you're trading on the monthlies and doing large size, it may actually go to the open pit. So my concern there was if I'm sitting there working an order, working the price, I want to be able to pull it back and replace it. If it's I don't know if that would work good if it has to chase somebody down. So I just put that in there. So hopefully that would guarantee it.
But now, Gary, when these begin to percolate out, though, I believe you told me that this will favor the monthlies over the weeklies, or not necessarily? Yeah.
Currently, whenever you have a monthly and a weekly on the same date, I'll only use the monthlies. I'll never do a weekly that is on the same day of the monthly. That's just kind of right now I can only handle one expiration per day. So that's the way I'm dealing with that. And I believe that's, for me, I believe it's favorable. It's what I'd want it to do anyway.
And Tom pointed out that we're going to give a little bit of discount for an annual subscription. So it's $15 a month or $150 a year.
Right, you get 2 free months if you do a year.
Yeah.
Yep. All right. Well, we're let's see, one more from Ken and Dot. Report the RTT subscribers, the add-on 60.
I will, Ken and Dot. If I take one, I will report that. Yes, because I'm assuming you would want me to do that. Yes. So I will do that.
Okay, and then Randy asked, how often can you actually get filled at that mid price? I've found on the ES, I'm usually getting filled at the mid or maybe a nickel off most of the time.
I'm pretty close unless we get a situation like what happened this morning, that the market moves immediately after you place the order. If it starts to move immediately, you'll have to work that price if you still want it. But yeah, generally I've been very close on both the SPX and ES.
All right. Well, I think we've run out of questions, and we're a little over an hour, so this is probably a good place to stop. So thank you, Gary and Dan, for joining us. Gary, great presentation, and really appreciate all the work you've done on this tool. It's really a huge time saver, and certainly worth 50 cents a day, or even less if you do an annual subscription.
Well, it really is, Gary, and thank you for the time you took to make this presentation, and thank you in particular for coming up with this software. It has made a difference. It's made a major difference in my daily life when I'm getting ready to put on a trade. And so, thank you so much.
Okay, appreciate it.
All right, thanks everyone. We will see you next time.